In the last episode of History Traveler, we started looking at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge was an engagement by the Canadian Corps, which had 4 different divisions in it, that was a part of the larger Battle of Arras, and it has gone down as a legendary engagement in Canadian military history. Well, in that episode, we focused mainly on the 3rd and 4th Divisions. Today, we're going to look at a few places and stories associated with the 1st and 2nd. We're starting off today in the village of Equivre. This is the area that was in the rear of the Canadian Corps. So you can kind of come back here for rest and refit. And this village in particular is where the 1st Infantry Division of the Canadians had their headquarters. So Arthur Currie was the commander of the 1st Infantry Division. He would later go on to command the Corps. And this was an area to kind of rest and refit and get ready for battle. There was a dressing station here where men who were wounded could come and be treated. There were all kinds of little Nissen huts here where men could get out of the elements. And some of these guys left a little bit of an interesting mark. What we are looking at here, obviously, is the old church here in Equivre. And I just love these old churches. Now, this was far enough back that it didn't sustain any damage during the fighting that took place here from 1914 all the way through 1917, 1918. So if we were to dig down beneath the surface here and get below the dirt, well, what you would find is a lot of chalk. So it's a softer material. People who built these churches and built these homes used it as their building material, including building material for this church. Now imagine that you were a young infantryman in the Canadian Army in the 1st Infantry Division, and you were back here and you were just bored as heck. Well, the urge to come in and start carving things in this soft chalk might prove to be irresistible. So if we look right here, you can see where some kind of pattern has been carved into the stone. Now, whether that was a soldier or not, I don't know. We're going to take a little walk back here and just see what we can find. Now, you got to really be careful. I came back here and just took a quick glance. You have to really be careful because people in the years since World War I have come in and also made their mark. But here's one right here. You can see it says April 8th, 1917. So, wow, that would have been Easter Sunday of 1917. That was the day before the Battle of Vimy Ridge kicked off, and I can't really read what that says. CC something. Here we have another one. P. Assat. Looks like 160th Infantry. And then the dates down there etched in 1914 to 1915. And again, some of these are newer, so I don't want to look at the wrong ones. What the heck? Okay. I swear that I did not do that. I don't have the time right now, and I would not carve my name into the stone anyway. I'm not into graffiti, and I definitely wouldn't put a heart around my name. Huh. Okay, found a few more here. I can't really make this out. What I can read is down at the bottom. It says Somme, 1415, so 1914 to 1915. This also looks like it could be something, and this one is definitely something. So this is D. Bogue, 4th Battalion, Canadian Infantry. And then here you can see the date that he marked it. So it was a little bit later. So 3718. Also gives his regiment number there. That's really interesting. So we'll have to look that up. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know if that's anything or not. Okay, found a few more. Here's an A. Howard with the Suffolk Regiment. Looks like it was marked sometime in 1917. I don't know exactly when. Here's another, the initial CBS, April 6th, maybe, of 1917. And then, again, we just got a whole bunch of junk over here. Oh, here we go. W. Greenlees, 31st Battalion, 25th of February. And we've lost the date there. I'm guessing 1917. All right, and then here is another. Oh, wait, here's another yet. For C.A. Ryan. Man, this is just cool as heck to see these names. I'm not advocating carving your name into a church wall, but for historic purposes, it's kind of neat. On the other side of this wall that you see here behind me is where the men from the 1st Infantry Division were quartered while they were here in Equavre. And as April 9th approached, maybe right here through this gate, you would have seen soldiers streaming out, making their way to the front at Vimy Ridge. And among them were two guys from the 1st Battalion by the name of Horuss and Stanley Stokes. Now, it's not uncommon to find brothers who served together in World War I. What's a little less common is to find father and son pairs. Horuss was the father of Stanley Stokes, who was only 16 years old, and they would be making their way to the front together at Vimy Ridge. I've made my way over to the sector of the Vimy Ridge front where the 1st Infantry Division made their assault. And this is the far right flank of the assault on the southern end of Vimy Ridge. So in the other video, we were looking at the far left flank. Now over on the left flank, they didn't have to go as far, but the terrain with Hill 145 was pretty formidable. On this part of the battlefield, well, you can see it's pretty flat, but the distance that the 1st Infantry Division was going to have to go was a lot more than what they had to do on the left. From where I'm standing right now, we're looking kind of off to the west. So just on the other side of this big field is where the front line for the Canadian 1st Infantry Division would have been. So we are standing in what would have been the German sector. And the final destination, or the final objective for the Canadian 1st, was the village of Farbus, which is a pretty good distance away. Now, The soldiers who came out of the frontline trenches over here didn't have to make that whole stretch by themselves. The Allies had kind of adapted some of their methods and adopted like this leapfrogging approach. So there were 4 phase lines here in the Vimy Ridge sector, 4 like objective lines. So there was what was called the black line, and then the red line, and then the blue line, and then finally the brown line. The brown line was going to be up near Farbus. These guys only had to cover the first 2 lines. It was the 2nd Brigade that was right here. And then the 1st Brigade would be following up and then taking the fight on. It's really hard for us to imagine what it would have been like for these soldiers who were advancing across this flat terrain here. The guys who moved through this area were following what was called a rolling artillery barrage, where the artillery would basically fire this barrage in front of them. They would fire in one spot for like 3 minutes, and then they would advance it about 90 meters, and then they would fire on that for about 90 minutes. And the soldiers were supposed to hug this barrage, sometimes as close as like 60 or 70 meters. And then the idea was, as the artillery barrage moves through the German lines, you have your infantry that are right behind it and can jump in and mop up. And there's one soldier that described what this was like. Here are the words of a 5'2" former journalist by the name of Lieutenant Gregory Clark, who describes what it was like advancing behind one of these rolling artillery barrages. He says, "In one sense, it was a beautiful sight. It was still quite dark. Sleet was falling. There before us, frightfully close, was the edge of hell. It blazed and flashed and flickered, the bursting shells, and white and colored flares were fired frantically by a distracted enemy. And the flashing, flickering lights showed an infernal wall of twisting, boiling smoke and flame, against which stood out the distorted silhouettes of men advancing into it." As you can see, I'm also standing close to a cemetery here on the battlefield. This is the Arras Road Cemetery. And even though there's a highway that cuts right through the battlefield, you probably heard the road noise in the background, I don't think that this cemetery gets a whole lot of traffic because there's no access from the main highway, and getting here was kind of on a not well used road. But in this cemetery, there are a lot of Canadian graves. So if we walk over here, well, you can see, like, here is a guy by the name of Lupton, who was with the 7th Battalion, Canadian Infantry. Here's an Emerson, 7th Battalion, Canadian Infantry. All of these guys, you can see, died around between the 8th and the 10th. They're all in the 7th Battalion. 7th Battalion was part of the 2nd Brigade that moved right through this area. All right, we are going to hop back into the vehicle now and leave this place and continue following the path of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division on their assault of Vimy Ridge. On the right flank of the Canadian advance were two towns that were really in an unfortunate position. Those are the towns of Thalys and Farbus. Farbus was going to be kind of the final objective for the Canadians, and Thalys was in the middle. Now, we're in the town of Thalys currently. We've ventured a little bit outside of the 1st Canadian Division sector, and we're more in the 2nd Canadian Division sector, but I've passed this monument several times now and wanted to stop and give it a look. This is a monument that says was placed in memory of the officers and non-commissioned officers and men of the Canadian Corps Artillery who fell during the Vimy operation April 1917. And it is quite a large monument. Here you can see these replica artillery shells here. And you might be thinking, oh, the artillery, they're kind of behind the lines. It seems like it would be a safer position to be. Well, not so much. Think about this. If somebody is hurling these large projectiles at you, who on the battlefield do you want to take out? So these guys were subjected to a lot of counter battery fire and from the Germans, which obviously is going to be quite dangerous. But yeah, here's a monument to the Canadian Corps Artillery. By mid-morning, the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Canadian Division had moved through the first phase line, the black line, and they had made it all the way up to the red line, which is where I am right now. Well, if you look behind us, it's all farm fields today, but on April 9th of 1917, this would have been a vast network of German trenches, and it would have been all turned up from the battle. And at this point, there was a lull in the fighting to allow the 1st Brigade to get up to this position and carry on the fight. Now, again, as I just mentioned, we are looking at this today, and it's nothing but farm fields. And if you didn't know anything about the history, you wouldn't really know any better that one of the most violent actions of the war took place right here. One of the guys in the 1st Brigade recounted his experience getting up to this point, and the way he describes it, it sounds like something out of Dantes Inferno. He says that as they were walking or making their way up to this position, there were just dead bodies and pieces of soldiers everywhere. He saw one German who was split from his head all the way down the middle. Just a horrific scene. He also said that these guys are under fire as they are making their way up here to this spot, and there was a dud artillery shell that flew right by him and hit the machine gunner standing next to him, took off that guy's head, and he said that the body kept moving forward as blood was spurting out of the neck, and looked back, and the shell had gone through that guy's head and had taken off the leg of the guy behind him. So by the time they got up here, these guys had been through an ordeal. When the 1st Brigade got up to this position, with them was the father and son pair that I was talking about earlier, Horuss and Stanley Stokes. So from right here, they would have picked up the fight and advanced with their comrades across this ground to the next phase line. When people think about World War I and weapons, they typically first think about machine guns and gas. The biggest killer in World War I was artillery. And somewhere between here and the next phase line, young Stanley Stokes was going to become one of the many who was going to be hit by shell fire. I've made my way back to where the 1st Infantry Division had their headquarters here in the village of Equavre. And at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that there was a schoolhouse here that had been converted to an aid station. Well, this is where Horuss Stokes brought his 16-year-old son. And I can only imagine the panic that must have been welling up inside of him as he was bringing him back, hoping that he could get him here in time and that the doctors could do something to save his life. But unfortunately, Stanley Stokes, at 16 years old, was going to die in that aid station. And he would be buried right here in the Equivra Military Cemetery. This is the Equivra Military Cemetery. This cemetery serves as the final resting place to over 1,700 soldiers of the Great War. And as you stand here in this section, well, you can just see row upon row upon row of headstones with the Canadian maple leaf on it. And a lot of them have the same date of death. So here you have A.W. Starrett, who died on the 9th of April. E.E. Beckett, who died on the 9th of April. F. Wade, who died on the 9th of April, the opening day of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And among them is Private Stanley Thomas Stokes, 1st Battalion, Canadian Infantry, who died on the 9th of April, 1917. This is such a tragic story, and standing here, I can't help but put myself into Horuss Stokes' shoes. A couple of years ago, when the Russians ramped up their aggression in Ukraine and launched a full-on invasion to conquer the country, I felt like I needed to do something. So I ended up taking a leave of absence and made plans to go over and assist in whatever way that I could. And at the last minute, my 19-year-old son ended up going with me. And his mother dropped us off at the airport, and of course she was in tears. And as she was driving away, I looked at him and I said, here's the deal. We didn't know what was going on at that time. We didn't know if the country was going to be taken over or not. But I said, we go over together, and we come back together. So I can't imagine how grief-stricken Horuss must have been when he sat down and wrote this letter to his wife. I have yours of March 11th, and today I got the box of cigars. I am so very sorry Stanley cannot help to smoke them. He was killed in action about 3 hours after the start of the big drive on Easter Monday. He and 4 others were struck by a shell. He was carried to a dressing station and died before they could get him away. He lies buried in the military cemetery about 3 miles from where he fell. He was very anxious to be in on the drive. He died like many another brave soldier, and I am proud of him. We are having a very hard time, and I am writing this in an open field, and it is raining hard. But it is the first chance I have had since going into action Easter Sunday night, and as soon as we get off the battlefield, I will write and tell you all about the fight. Now, as hard as it must have been for Horuss to sit down and write that letter, I can only imagine how difficult it was for his wife to receive it, knowing that she was never going to see her son again, may not ever be able to visit his grave, and that she was going to have to grieve without her husband. Unfortunately, that was not the last letter that Mrs. Stokes would be receiving, because the war was not yet through with her family. In the weeks and months after Stanley's death, I'm sure that Horuss continued to grieve, but the war kept going, and he kept going right along with it, fighting with the 1st Canadian Division. And I'm sure that back at home, his wife continued to grieve the loss of her son and was praying for the war to end so she could get her husband back. But unfortunately, in September of the same year, 1917, she would be receiving yet another letter. I have moved up and have basically followed the same path of the Canadians in World War I, and I'm currently standing in the Aix-Nolet Communal Cemetery. And here before us, you see on this grave marker is the final resting place of Horuss J. Stokes. 1st Battalion, Canadian Infantry, died, as it's marked here, the 19th of September, 1917, at the age of 40. And on the 20th of September, one of his comrades wrote a letter to his wife, and it reads, "Dear Madam, it is with deep regret that I have to write this letter, giving some details on the death and action of your husband, Private Horuss Stokes, on the night of September 18th, 1917. He had been under my command for 3 months and had showed himself at all times a good soldier, and at the last he was killed by a bomb while holding his ground in an advanced post against a hostile bombing party. He was instantly killed and had no suffering at all. The personal effects were sent through proper channels and will be forwarded to you from London, England. His body was brought out and will be buried with every respect in a military cemetery behind the lines, and a suitable cross with inscription erected by the battalion. I knew your late husband personally and had a high regard for him as a man and as a soldier, and he died as only a good soldier can, doing his duty. May the Almighty grant you and the family comfort in the hour of your bereavement." Well, that was a little bit on the 1st Canadian Division in the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and honestly what is one of the saddest stories that I've come across in the First World War. It's tragic to think that Horuss dies in September of 1917, and the war was going to grind on for over a year after that. One has to wonder how many more tragic stories did it produce between the time that Horuss died and when the guns fell silent in November of 1918.